It was a quiet evening, the kind of night when the roads were almost empty and the air felt still. A U.S. Army major was driving home from a long day of duty. He was wearing his uniform, proud as always, the same way he had been since the day he joined the service. The road stretched ahead of him, calm and empty, and the sound of his tires rolling over the asphalt was the only thing breaking the silence. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't breaking any law. He was simply driving home, thinking about how peaceful the night felt. The car was new, freshly washed, and he had just gotten it registered. The temporary plate was taped neatly inside the rear window, easy to see if someone cared to look. As he passed under the streetlights, he noticed flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror. For a second, he thought maybe the police car wanted to pass. He moved slightly to the side, but the lights stayed behind him. The sirens weren't on, but the flashing lights told him he was being pulled over. He frowned a little, wondering why. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but he'd been taught, as every serviceman had, to stay calm, to think clearly, and not act on emotion. So he slowed down gently and put on his hazard lights to signal that he had seen the officers. Still, something didn't feel right. The road was dark, surrounded by trees, and there wasn't much light. The next gas station wasn't too far ahead, and it was well lit. So instead of stopping right there in the dark, he decided to drive slowly toward the gas station. He wasn't trying to run. He wasn't trying to escape. He was just trying to make sure everyone was safe, himself and the officers too. He had seen enough stories in the news to know that misunderstandings during traffic stops could go wrong. And as a black man, he was always careful. He had learned to move slow, to speak calmly, and to keep his hands where everyone could see them. The flashing lights stayed behind him. The officers didn't know what he was thinking, and maybe they didn't care. They only saw a driver who wasn't pulling over right away. But inside the car, the major was focused, steady, and careful. He spoke softly to himself, almost like a whisper. "All right, just stay calm. Pull into the light. Keep your hands visible." He drove another minute or two until the bright lights of the gas station came into view. The station was empty, quiet except for the hum of the fuel pumps. He turned in slowly and parked under the bright overhead lights. He wanted it to be clear that he wasn't hiding or running. He was simply trying to be safe. As soon as the car stopped, he turned off the engine and kept his hands on the steering wheel. He could see movement in the mirror, 2 officers getting out of their patrol car. Their flashlights were already pointed toward him. He felt his heart beating faster. He had done this before. Traffic stops weren't new to him, but this time felt different. He could sense tension even before anyone spoke. He took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and waited. One of the officers shouted something, but it was hard to make out at first. Their voices were loud, sharp, echoing through the quiet night. The light from the flashlights hit his face, blinding him for a second. He tried to stay calm. "I'm just trying to understand what's happening, officer," he said politely through the slightly open window. The voices grew louder. They were telling him to put his hands out of the window, to open the door, to step out. But they were talking over each other, giving different instructions at once. He hesitated, not because he was defiant, but because he was confused. He didn't want to make a sudden move and be misunderstood, so he kept his hands where they could see them and spoke again, his voice calm and respectful. "Sir, I'm currently serving in the U.S. Army. I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I just wanted to stop somewhere safe and well lit." The words didn't seem to make a difference. The tension in the air was heavy. The flashlights stayed fixed on his face. Inside the car, he could feel a wave of disbelief washing over him. He couldn't understand why the situation was so aggressive when he hadn't even been told what he did wrong. He had done everything he was supposed to do, signaled, slowed down, stopped in a safe place. Yet it still felt like he was being treated as a threat. He remembered something his father had told him years ago before he ever wore the uniform. "When you're out there, always stay polite. Always keep your cool. Don't give anyone a reason to say you didn't." So he did exactly that. He kept his tone even, his movements controlled. "Officer," he said again, "please, can you tell me why I'm being stopped?" The light stayed in his eyes. No clear answer came, only more shouts, more confusion. He could feel his throat tighten, but he refused to let fear take over. The situation didn't make sense. How could someone serving his country, someone who'd spent years learning discipline, honor, and self-control, be treated this way during a simple stop? He looked around the gas station. The bright lights that had once made him feel safe now felt harsh and cold. The street beyond the station was empty. No one else was around. Just him, the flashing blue lights, and the two officers standing tense and rigid. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't move suddenly. He stayed exactly where he was, trying to speak clearly and respectfully. "Sir, I'm afraid right now," he admitted softly. "I'm just trying to follow instructions." That honesty came from a place of humanity, from the truth that no matter how trained, disciplined, or experienced you are, moments like this can still shake you. Inside the patrol car, one of the officers was speaking into his radio. The other stayed near the driver's side, barking commands. Every second felt like an hour. The major could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wanted to believe it would end peacefully, that reason would step in. But he also knew, from too many headlines and too many past stories, that sometimes reason wasn't enough. He thought about his service, about the nights spent away from home, the sacrifices he'd made, the pride he carried in wearing his country's uniform. He had always believed in respect and fairness. He had always believed that when you did the right thing, others would see it. And yet, sitting there in that car, he felt small, uncertain, and strangely helpless. He could see one of the officers gripping something on his belt. It made him uneasy, though he tried not to show it. He wanted to trust that the men behind those uniforms would handle things with care. The silence that followed was thick. The only sound was the engine cooling and the faint buzz of the station's lights. He kept his eyes forward, hands still. He tried to remember every piece of training he'd had. Stay calm, breathe slowly, don't react to fear. He knew that the next few minutes could define the night, maybe even his life. The thought that he could be seen as dangerous just for existing, just for trying to get home safely, hurt in a quiet way that words couldn't fully describe. As the moment stretched on, a part of him began to hope that maybe, just maybe, the officers would calm down and see him as a person. Not a problem, not a suspect, just a man trying to get home. He waited for that shift, for a sign that things would cool down. But it didn't come. The tension lingered like heavy smoke in the air, and under the bright lights of that lonely gas station, the U.S. Army major sat still in his car, hands high, praying that respect and reason would return before something went wrong. He wasn't sure how this night would end, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had done everything right. He had been calm. He had been respectful. He had been human. And somehow, that still didn't feel like enough. The bright lights of the gas station kept shining above him as he sat still inside his car. His hands were still raised, his heart steady but uneasy. The flashing blue and red lights bounced across the car's surface, coloring everything with a tense rhythm. The two officers were still outside, shouting commands that kept changing. One voice was louder than the other, filled with anger that didn't make sense for a simple traffic stop. He blinked a few times, trying to see clearly through the harsh light shining directly in his eyes. His training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but this wasn't a battlefield. It was supposed to be a routine encounter on a quiet night. Still, the tension felt heavier with each passing second. "Sir," he said slowly, trying to sound respectful, "I'm just trying to do what you're asking. Please tell me exactly what you want me to do." The answer came as another shout. "Put your hands out the window." He had already done that, but he didn't argue. He simply kept them out, fingers spread, the way he'd seen people do in police safety videos. His mind kept repeating one thought: don't move too fast. Don't make them nervous. Then came another voice. "Turn off the engine." He hesitated. Turning off the engine meant moving his hands, and moving his hands could be misunderstood. He spoke carefully, explaining, "My hands are out of the window, sir. If I reach in, I just don't want you to think I'm doing anything wrong." But instead of calm conversation, he got more shouting. The tone felt personal now, like anger was building for no reason. He could sense it. That shift when a person stops seeing you as a human being and starts seeing you as a threat. He had spent years serving his country, learning discipline, control, and communication. But none of that seemed to matter here. It was as if his words didn't reach them at all. He turned his head slightly to see one officer standing closer to his door, his hand resting near his belt. The other one was a few feet behind, watching but not saying much. The one in front kept yelling, telling him to get out of the car. "I'm afraid to move, sir," he said softly. "I'm honestly afraid to get out." There was a pause, a heavy silence before the officer answered in a cold, almost mocking tone. "You should be." That sentence stayed in the air like a crack in glass. It was short, but it hit hard. The words carried a weight that no one could ignore, a mix of threat and cruelty that didn't belong in that moment. The major blinked slowly, his breath unsteady for the first time that night. He wasn't sure if he had heard correctly. He had faced difficult situations before, dangerous ones, but this was something different. This wasn't about risk. This was about disrespect. Inside the car, he took a deep breath, trying to keep control of his emotions. He wasn't going to argue, and he wasn't going to fight back. He was trained to be calm even when others weren't. He tried once more. "Sir, I just want to understand what's happening. Can you please tell me what I did wrong?" No answer. Only louder voices. The light from their flashlights kept moving, shaking slightly as if the people holding them were nervous or angry. He could see their reflections in his side mirror. The expressions on their faces were not what he expected. There was no calm professionalism, no patience. Instead, there was frustration, even aggression, over something that didn't need it. He knew that sometimes fear could make people act unreasonably. Maybe they thought he was dangerous just because he hadn't stopped right away on the dark road. But in his mind, stopping in a well-lit area was the safest thing to do, for him and for them. He hoped that once they realized this, things would settle down. Maybe they would finally listen. But that hope was fading fast. One of the officers stepped closer, shouting again for him to open the car door. His hand stayed on the handle, unsure of what to do. He didn't want to move without permission. Every move felt like it could be the wrong one. "I'm trying to cooperate," he said again, his voice steady but strained. "Please, I just need you to tell me what I did wrong." This time, one of them replied with a sarcastic laugh. "You'll find out soon enough," he said. The major's heart sank a little. He wasn't sure why it was turning into this kind of situation. There was no reason for it. No danger, no crime, no threat. Just a misunderstanding that was quickly getting out of hand. Inside the car, his uniform still felt tight against his chest. The patches on his shoulder carried meaning, service, honor, duty. He had worked hard for them. But right now, they didn't seem to matter at all. He looked at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. He could see the fear in his eyes, but also something else, disappointment. Not in himself, but in what this moment said about the world around him. The shouting continued. The light stayed in his face. His thoughts drifted for a moment, to his family, his friends, the people who had always told him that wearing that uniform meant something. That it meant people would respect you, trust you. But that night, sitting in his car under the gas station lights, he realized something painful. Sometimes, no matter what you wear, some people only see what they want to see. He didn't want to believe that this was about race or bias. He wanted to believe that it was just confusion. But deep down, a quiet voice inside him whispered that it was more than that. The tone of the officers told him everything. The anger, the lack of patience, the dismissive words. They weren't treating him as a person anymore. They were treating him as a stereotype. Still, he refused to lose his composure. He kept his hands visible, his voice calm. He reminded himself that he wasn't alone, that truth, fairness, and accountability still existed. Maybe not in that moment, but eventually. The night air was cool, but sweat ran down the side of his face. His heart was steady, but his mind was racing. He thought about what could happen next. He thought about all the things he couldn't control. And yet, he kept trying to find a way to calm the situation down. "Sir," he said again, in a voice that was patient but tired. "Please, I'm not resisting. I'm following your commands. I just want to go home safely." For a moment, there was quiet. Then one of the officers walked around the back of the car, shining his light through the rear window. He must have finally noticed the temporary plate. The major could see his shadow pause for a second. Maybe, just maybe, he realized that this stop had no real reason to continue, but the other officer didn't seem ready to let it go. His tone stayed sharp, almost angry that the situation wasn't escalating the way he wanted. The major kept breathing deeply, in and out, just like he'd done in training. He remembered something one of his commanders once told him. The hardest battles aren't the ones fought overseas. They're the ones you fight when you're just trying to do the right thing and no one's listening. That night, he understood those words in a new way. He wasn't in a foreign country or a combat zone. He was in his own town, wearing his own nation's uniform, facing the kind of treatment he thought his service had protected him from. But he wasn't going to give in to anger. He wasn't going to match aggression with aggression. He knew that his dignity was his strength, so he waited, calmly, patiently, even when the shouting continued, even when the lights stayed on him, because deep down, he believed that truth always came out, that sooner or later, someone would see the whole picture and understand what really happened that night. He didn't know that cameras were already recording, that the world would soon see what he was seeing, that his calmness, his restraint, his patience would become evidence of something much bigger than that single traffic stop. For now, all he could do was sit there, one man alone under harsh lights, trying to hold on to his faith and fairness. The night wasn't over yet. The misunderstanding hadn't ended. But he had made a quiet decision in his heart. No matter what they said or did, he wouldn't lose himself to anger. He would keep his voice calm. He would keep his hands visible. He would stay the man he was raised and trained to be, respectful, steady, and strong, even when the world didn't show him the same respect in return. And as the shouting echoed once more through the empty gas station, the major stared straight ahead, knowing this night would change everything. The bright lights of the gas station still flickered softly above the car. The night felt endless now. Time seemed to move slower, every second stretching longer than the last. The major's hands were still out of the window, calm and steady, even as the officers kept shouting from behind the glare of their flashlights. He could feel the sting of tension pressing against his chest. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a deep mix of disbelief and sadness. He had served his country proudly for years, learned how to stay composed in pressure, and faced situations that would break most people. But this moment, this strange and unfair situation, tested him in a way he never expected. He tried to take another deep breath, but the air felt heavy. The lights hurt his eyes. His mind raced, wondering how something so small, a missing visible license plate that was actually there, could turn into this. "Sir, I'm doing what you said," he said again, his voice steady but gentle. "Please, I don't want any trouble. I'm following your instructions." The officers didn't seem to listen. Their tone stayed sharp, echoing through the empty gas station. The major could tell they weren't hearing his words. They were only hearing their own anger. One of them moved closer, his hand still resting near his belt. The other circled behind the car again, pacing like he was waiting for something to happen. The whole thing felt off. The major had dealt with authority his whole life. He knew the tone of professional command, and this wasn't it. He wanted to believe that things would calm down, that someone would realize this was all a mistake. But instead, the shouting grew louder. He kept his posture straight, trying not to show frustration or fear. Inside the car, he could feel his heart beating hard against his uniform. He had been taught that calmness was a kind of strength, and tonight, that lesson mattered more than ever. The officer nearest to him shouted again for him to get out. His voice cracked with impatience. The major tried to explain one more time that he didn't feel safe moving quickly, but his words were cut off by another harsh command. He hesitated just for a moment, but that hesitation seemed to make them even more aggressive. It was strange, almost surreal. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't resisting. He was simply trying to be careful, trying not to make the kind of mistake that could be misunderstood. But the more careful he was, the more they seemed to misread him. He realized painfully that nothing he said or did would make sense to them. Finally, with slow movements, he reached to unlock his seatbelt, explaining each motion aloud so they could hear him. "I'm taking off my seatbelt now, sir. My hands are visible." Still, the shouting didn't stop. The orders kept coming, rapid and inconsistent. He couldn't even tell which voice he was supposed to follow anymore. The bright lights, the yelling, the confusion. It all created a kind of storm around him. He was calm in the center of it, but it was draining him. He glanced once more at the reflection in his rearview mirror. He saw his own eyes, tired but unbroken. He thought of his fellow soldiers, of what they'd say if they saw him like this. They would tell him to stand tall, to remember who he was. That thought gave him strength. He kept his hands visible as he spoke again, his tone polite but weary. "Officers, I just want to make sure we all stay safe tonight. That's all I'm trying to do." The words hung there, but they didn't change anything. The next few minutes felt unreal. One of the officers stepped closer again, and for the first time the major could see the man's face clearly. His expression wasn't calm or cautious, it was hard, almost cold. The major felt a wave of sadness. How could people in positions of trust act like this towards someone who had done nothing wrong? But even then he didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just kept repeating that he wanted to understand what was happening. At one point, he tried to mention his military status again, hoping it might calm things down. "Sir, I'm active duty," he said softly. "I'm serving in the U.S. Army." He expected at least a small moment of recognition or respect. But instead the officer gave a small smirk, like the words meant nothing. That look hurt more than any threat. It was the look that said, "You don't matter here." The major could feel his throat tighten, but he didn't let it show. He wasn't going to lose his composure. Not in front of people who clearly didn't care about fairness or decency. He adjusted his posture slightly, keeping his voice calm. "I'm just trying to go home," he said. The officer didn't respond. He kept his flashlight pointed at the major's face, the beam unmoving. Time kept crawling forward. Every second felt longer than the last. The air smelled faintly of gasoline from the pumps nearby, and the night insects buzzed softly in the distance. It was strange how normal sounds continued in such an abnormal moment. The major's mind drifted for a moment, remembering the long nights overseas, times when he had to make quick decisions that affected lives. Those moments were tense, but they were guided by duty, not emotion. He wished the same could be said for the men standing in front of him now. He looked at their faces again, hoping to find even a hint of reason or compassion. But there was none. The louder officer's expression stayed fixed, his jaw tight. The major wondered if anything could make this man see the situation clearly. "Sir?" he tried one more time, his voice carrying quiet strength. "I've done everything you asked. Please, I just want to go home safely." There was no real answer, just more noise. At that moment, the major realized that he wasn't just trying to stay calm for himself. He was staying calm for everyone watching, because he knew that someday someone would see this. Someone would hear the tone, see his restraint, and understand what truly happened. That thought gave him a kind of quiet courage. The night air felt colder now. He could feel the chill creeping through the open window. His eyes burned slightly from the harsh light, but he didn't blink. He knew this was no longer about a traffic stop. This was about power, pride, and prejudice. Still, he refused to be broken by it. He had faced harder things before. He had stood in dangerous places, worked in chaos, and helped people in crisis. But nothing had ever felt as unfair as this, a moment where doing everything right still wasn't enough. Minutes passed. The shouting began to die down slightly, not because they calmed, but because they ran out of things to say. The major stayed still, hands steady, heart heavy but unshaken. He didn't know how this would end. He didn't know if they would eventually realize their mistake or make things worse. But in that moment, he made a quiet promise to himself. He promised that no matter how the night unfolded, he would keep his dignity. He would not let anger take over. He would represent himself and every person who had been treated unfairly with patience and self-control. As the tension hung in the air, a passing car slowed near the gas station. The headlights washed briefly over the scene before disappearing down the road. The major wondered if the driver realized what they had just witnessed, a man sitting quietly, surrounded by people who couldn't see his humanity. He took one more slow breath. He knew that the truth had a way of finding its light, even in moments of darkness, and as he sat there, with every ounce of discipline and courage he had, he knew deep down that this night would not be forgotten. It wasn't just another encounter, it was a mirror, held up to the kind of injustice people often tried to ignore. But the major wasn't going to be silent about it. He would carry himself with grace, tell his story when the time came, and trust that someday, fairness would speak louder than fear. The shouting eventually faded into the distance of the night. The light still flashed behind him, and the air still felt heavy, but he sat there, strong, calm, and unwavering. He didn't know it yet, but cameras were recording every word, every tone, every action, and one day soon, the world would see what happened in that quiet gas station under the glare of those bright, unkind lights. The gas station lights still glowed above the car, but now the scene had shifted. The tension was still there, but something felt different. The night air carried a kind of silence that made every sound sharper. The distant hum of cars on the highway, the low buzz of the station's neon sign, and the faint breathing of a man who had just been through one of the most humiliating moments of his life. The U.S. Army major sat quietly, trying to gather his thoughts. The officers had backed away slightly, still talking to each other, their voices low but sharp. He could see them glancing at each other, whispering, maybe trying to decide what to do next. He kept his hands visible, his body still. He didn't want to move, not even a little. He had already seen how quickly calmness could be mistaken for defiance, so he sat there breathing deeply, keeping his focus on staying grounded. In that moment, everything around him felt unreal. The same men who had shouted at him, the same men who had treated him as if he were dangerous, were now struggling to justify their actions. He could see it in their faces. They didn't expect him to stay calm. They didn't expect him to speak clearly or stay composed. They expected fear, anger, or chaos. But instead, they got silence, the kind of silence that spoke louder than anything else. One of the officers walked toward him again, slower this time. His voice was different, less commanding, more uneasy. "All right," the officer said, trying to sound in control. "You can relax now." But the major didn't move. He wasn't sure what relax even meant at that point. After everything that had happened, it didn't feel like the right time to let his guard down. "Sir," he said calmly, "am I being detained or am I free to go?" The question seemed to catch the officer off guard. There was a brief pause before he answered, "We'll figure that out." The major nodded slightly but said nothing else. He knew the truth. There was nothing to figure out. He hadn't done anything wrong. His car was properly registered. His temporary plate was clearly visible, and he had done everything by the book. Still, he stayed quiet. Sometimes silence has more power than words. The officers walked away again, talking in low tones near their patrol car. The major could see their silhouettes reflected on the gas station windows. They seemed unsure, maybe even nervous now. It was as if they were realizing that what they had just done couldn't easily be explained. Minutes passed. The night felt longer with each one. The major's breathing began to steady. He wasn't angry anymore, not in the way people might expect. What he felt was deeper than anger. It was disappointment, a sadness that came from knowing that even when you do everything right, you can still be treated like you've done something wrong. He thought about his training again, all the lessons about patience, honor, and discipline. Those values had guided him through every difficult moment in his service. They were what kept him calm now. Finally, one of the officers approached again, this time with a different tone. "You're not being charged," he said quickly. "You can go once we finish the report." The major nodded. He didn't ask for an apology. He didn't expect one. He just wanted to leave this place and go home. But before they left, one of the officers said something that stayed with him for a long time. "Look," the officer said, "if you want to keep this quiet, it'll be better for everyone. You don't need to report it. It could cause trouble for you too." The words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. The major didn't respond. He just looked straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the road beyond the gas station. That small warning told him everything he needed to know. It wasn't about fairness. It was about protecting themselves. When they finally allowed him to leave, the major drove off slowly. His hands were still shaking slightly, not from fear but from the emotional weight of what had just happened. The road stretched ahead, dark and quiet again. But this time, the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt hollow. He kept driving, the glow of the dashboard lights reflecting softly on his face. Every few seconds, he glanced in the mirror, half expecting those blue lights to appear again. When he reached home, the first thing he did was sit still for a while. The house was quiet. The clock on the wall ticked softly. He rested his hands on the table, feeling the stillness around him. Then he took out his phone. He knew the police officers had been wearing cameras. He also knew his own car's dash cam had recorded everything. He didn't want revenge, but he did want accountability. So he decided to take the first step, to report what had happened, clearly and truthfully. He spent hours writing down every detail, the time, the location, the words that were said, and the way they made him feel. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't change anything. He just told the truth. When he finished, he sat back and took a deep breath. It felt heavy but also necessary. This wasn't just about him. It was about what was right. Days later, the department received his report. At first there was silence. Then slowly things began to move. The body camera footage was reviewed. The video showed exactly what he remembered. The flashing lights, the raised voices, the tension, the unfairness. There was no denying what had happened. When the footage became public, it spread quickly. People who watched it were shocked. The major's calmness stood out. His tone, his discipline, the way he kept his composure even while being treated unfairly. It reminded people that respect isn't about shouting or force. It's about humanity. The officers' actions, on the other hand, spoke for themselves. The story made its way to the news. Reporters began asking questions. Community leaders started speaking up. People who had faced similar treatment shared their own stories. The truth had finally come into the light. The major didn't seek fame or attention. He didn't go on television or give long interviews. He just wanted fairness. He wanted people to know that things like this could happen, even to those who serve and protect the country. Behind the scenes, investigations began. Meetings were held. Officials reviewed the footage again and again. And as pressure built, the department had no choice but to act. One of the officers was dismissed. The other faced disciplinary action. For many people, it still didn't feel like enough. But for the major, it was at least a start. A small sign that accountability still existed somewhere. As the days passed, people began reaching out to him, veterans, soldiers, everyday citizens, all sharing messages of support and respect. Some said his calmness inspired them. Others said it gave them hope that change was possible. For the major, those messages meant more than any headline. They reminded him that even in moments of injustice, kindness and understanding still lived in people's hearts. But he also knew the road ahead was long. Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, courage, and constant effort. Every time he thought about that night, he felt a mix of emotions: sadness for what happened, pride for how he handled it, and determination to make sure it wouldn't happen again to someone else. He didn't hate the officers. He didn't wish them harm. He only wished they had seen him as a person that night, not as a threat, not as a stereotype, but simply as a man in uniform, trying to get home. As the days turned into weeks, the story continued to spread. It became part of a larger conversation about respect, fairness, and the way people in power should treat those they serve. And though the experience had left a mark on him, the major carried himself with the same quiet dignity as before. He continued his duties, continued to serve, and continued to believe that integrity was stronger than injustice. He had faced humiliation, fear, and disrespect. But he had also shown the world something powerful, that calm courage can speak louder than hate, and somewhere deep down, he knew that his story, painful as it was, would help others, because sometimes the strongest battles aren't fought with weapons or words. They're fought with patience, truth, and the belief that doing what's right is worth it, no matter how hard it is. That night at the gas station had changed him, but it had also changed the people who watched, listened, and learned from it. And while justice doesn't erase pain, it can light the path forward, one honest story at a time. Days passed, but the memory of that night at the gas station stayed heavy on the major's mind. The flashing lights, the shouting, the confusion, they replayed in his head over and over. He wasn't angry anymore. He was just deeply disappointed that something so unfair could happen in a quiet town on an ordinary night. He tried to return to his normal routine. Each morning, he put on his uniform with the same pride he always had. He saluted his fellow officers, greeted his team, and went about his duties. But inside, something had changed. The experience had left a mark, a quiet reminder that respect and uniform alone didn't always protect you from injustice. He had filed his complaint. The process had begun, but it felt slow and uncertain. For a while, he didn't know if anyone would really take it seriously. Then one morning, a message popped up on his phone. Someone from a local news outlet wanted to talk to him. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't looking for attention. He didn't want to be in the spotlight or make headlines. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that silence only helped those who did wrong. Speaking up wasn't about revenge, and it was about truth. A few days later, the story went public. The news channel released part of the body camera footage. The video showed exactly what had happened that night: the calm voice of a respectful soldier and the unreasonable behavior of the officers. It didn't take long for people to start reacting. Within hours, the video began to spread online. On social media, people everywhere were sharing it, commenting and expressing their outrage. Viewers couldn't believe what they were seeing. Many said the same thing. How could this happen to someone who serves our country? Others said it wasn't just about one man. It was about something much bigger. About how people were treated unfairly every day simply because of who they were. The comments poured in by the thousands. Some people were angry, some were sad, and others were simply heartbroken. It was clear that the video had touched a nerve. The major didn't expect the response to be so huge. He sat at his kitchen table one night, scrolling through the messages. Some came from soldiers, others from strangers in different states, even from people overseas. They all thanked him for staying calm, for not losing control, and for showing dignity in a situation that could have gone much worse. He read one message that said, "Your calmness showed the world what real strength looks like." That one stayed with him. As the story grew, reporters started calling the town's police department. They wanted answers. The department, however, stayed quiet at first. They released a short statement saying the incident was being reviewed. But the public wasn't satisfied with silence. Within days, protests began outside the police station. People carried signs calling for accountability. They weren't loud or violent. They were peaceful, standing together to demand fairness. Community leaders spoke out, reminding everyone that trust between officers and citizens was something that had to be earned, not demanded. Churches, schools, and local organizations began to hold meetings. People talked openly about discrimination, about respect, and about the need for real change. The major didn't attend any of the rallies, but he watched them on TV. Seeing people stand up not just for him, but for justice itself brought tears to his eyes. He realized his story had become part of something larger, a movement for fairness and humanity. Meanwhile, pressure was building on the police department. Officials from the state began to ask questions. The governor called for an independent investigation. The Attorney General's office got involved. Behind the scenes, the major received calls from several organizations offering support: civil rights groups, veterans associations, and even people in government who wanted to make sure justice was done. Despite the attention, he stayed humble. Whenever someone asked him for a statement, he said the same thing: "I just want accountability. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." He wasn't trying to ruin anyone's life or destroy anyone's career. He only wanted fairness, the same fairness he believed in when he put on his military uniform every morning. As investigations continued, the officers involved were placed on leave. This was standard procedure, but for the public it wasn't enough. People wanted to know how two men who wore badges could behave that way towards someone who clearly meant no harm. Then, after several weeks, the police department released a new statement. It confirmed what many had hoped for. One of the officers had been dismissed from the force. The department said his behavior did not represent their values or their standards. The announcement made headlines. For the first time since that night, the major felt a small sense of relief. It didn't erase what had happened, but it showed that truth had been stronger than denial. Still, he knew this wasn't just about one firing. It was about a system that needed change. As the story continued to spread, national news outlets picked it up. Television shows and online programs discussed it, pointing out how the major's patience and calmness had exposed a deeper issue in society. People from all walks of life began using his story as an example of how to respond to injustice with dignity. Some even called him a symbol of quiet courage, but the major never saw himself that way. He saw himself as a man who had simply done what was right, a man who refused to lose his composure even when treated unfairly. He spent his days working as usual, staying out of the media as much as possible. His friends and colleagues often told him how proud they were of him, how his actions had inspired them. At home, he spent more time with his family. He had learned how quickly peace could be interrupted, how fragile trust could be. So he valued the small things even more now. Simple dinners, quiet evenings, long talks that reminded him of what really mattered. The investigation results were later made public. The report concluded that the officers had acted unprofessionally and failed to follow proper procedures. It also confirmed that the major had done everything correctly during the stop. That finding meant a lot to him. It was proof, not just for him but for everyone watching, that truth can't be hidden forever. After the report came out, the police chief personally reached out to apologize. It was brief but sincere. The major accepted the apology. He believed that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing peace over anger. As the months passed, the outrage turned into reflection. Communities started hosting discussions about improving police training, especially in small towns. New policies were introduced to make sure all traffic stops were handled with more professionalism and respect. The major watched these changes quietly, with a mix of hope and caution. He knew it would take time for real progress to stick, but at least it was a beginning. And as much as the experience had shaken him, it also reminded him of something important, that one person's calmness can inspire thousands to speak up, to demand better, and to believe that fairness is still possible. When people stopped him in public, they often thanked him for being brave, but he always gave the same answer. I wasn't trying to be brave. I was just trying to stay human. Those words, simple as they were, carried more meaning than anything else because in the end, his story wasn't just about injustice. It was about the strength it takes to stay kind, even when the world around you isn't, and somewhere deep down, he knew that night at the gas station had changed more than just his life. It had opened people's eyes. It had made others question, reflect, and stand together for something better. The road to justice wasn't over yet. There were still court cases, still meetings, still voices calling for change. But through it all, one thing was clear. The major's story had become a turning point. It reminded everyone watching that the truth may take time, but it always finds a way to be heard. And that's what gave the major peace, knowing that his calmness, his patience, and his unwavering dignity had helped light that path forward for others. The months that followed were quiet, but not empty. The U.S. Army major had gone back to his duties, slowly rebuilding his sense of peace. Life didn't return to how it was before. It rarely does after something like that. But he found new meaning in the silence. He didn't speak about the incident much anymore. It had been talked about enough in newsrooms, in meetings, in social media posts. Now he wanted to focus on what came next. But even as he tried to move forward, reminders of that night would come back in unexpected ways. Sometimes it was a stranger who stopped him in the grocery store just to shake his hand. Sometimes it was a letter in the mail, written by someone he'd never met, thanking him for his calmness. And sometimes it was just a quiet moment, driving down a road at night, seeing flashing lights in the distance and remembering how easily things could have gone differently. He never forgot that. But he also knew that his story had made a difference. After the investigation and the officer's dismissal, other departments began to take notice. There were new conversations about accountability, about the importance of body cameras, and about how officers handled interactions with civilians. The major had never asked to be a symbol, but his story became one anyway, not because of what happened to him, but because of how he responded. He often thought about that night and what made him stay calm. It wasn't fear or training alone. It was something deeper, a belief that reacting with anger would only make things worse. That belief, he realized, had turned into his greatest strength. When people asked how he stayed composed, he always said the same thing: when you know who you are, no one can take your peace away. Those words stayed with many who heard them. They became a quiet reminder that dignity isn't about what others give you. It's about what you refuse to lose. After the story settled, a few journalists asked him if he would like to be part of community discussions. At first, he declined. He wasn't comfortable standing on a stage or speaking into microphones. But later, when a local school invited him to speak to their students, he agreed. He thought it would be a small event, maybe a classroom talk, But when he arrived, the entire auditorium was full. Students, teachers, and parents all sat waiting to hear him speak. As he stood at the front, he looked around and felt something he hadn't felt in a while. Hope. He didn't prepare a speech. He just spoke from the heart. He told them about the night he was stopped, about the fear, and about the choice he made to stay calm. He explained that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't mean fighting. It means standing firm even when the world tries to shake you. He spoke about patience, respect, and the importance of truth. He told them that power doesn't come from force. It comes from integrity. The room was quiet as he spoke. Some people nodded. Others wiped their eyes. And when he finished, the students stood and applauded. Afterward, a young boy approached him and said softly, "I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to stay calm when people treat me wrong." Those words touched him more deeply than anything else. It reminded him why telling the truth mattered, not to relive the pain, but to plant seeds of understanding for the future. From that day, the major began to attend more community events. He met with law enforcement groups, schools, and veteran organizations. He shared his experience not with anger, but with purpose. Each time, he said the same thing. We can't change what happened yesterday, but we can decide how we treat each other today. Slowly, his story started to shift from one about injustice to one about strength and growth. People no longer just saw him as the man who was mistreated. They saw him as a man who turned pain into purpose. Meanwhile, the officer who had been fired publicly apologized months later. The major didn't expect it, but when he heard about it, he didn't feel bitterness. Instead, he felt peace. Everyone deserves a chance to learn, he thought. Change doesn't start with anger. It starts with accountability. He had no interest in revenge. What he wanted most was for people to understand that respect and decency shouldn't depend on how someone looks or what they wear. They should be given freely to everyone. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun go down, he thought about how life had turned out. What began as one of the hardest nights of his life had slowly become a turning point, not just for him, but for many. He thought about the people who had supported him, the ones who stood outside City Hall with signs, the strangers who sent kind words, the veterans who reached out to say they were proud of him. He realized that even when life feels unfair, there are always people who care, people who believe in justice, and people who stand quietly for what's right. Over time, the national attention faded. News stories took over the news cycle. But in his small community, his name remained a symbol of calm courage. Whenever tensions rose between officers and citizens, someone would mention his story, as a reminder that respect must go both ways. One day, the local police department invited him to attend a new training session they had created in response to his case. It focused on communication, empathy, and de-escalation. He accepted the invitation. When he arrived, he was surprised to see young officers, some fresh out of the academy, listening carefully as instructors spoke about fairness and patience. During a break, one of them approached him. "Sir," the young officer said, "I studied your case in training. I just want to say your calmness taught me something I'll never forget." The major smiled and nodded. "Then it was worth it," he said quietly. In that moment, he realized something powerful. The story that once brought him pain had now turned into a lesson, one that might help prevent others from facing the same injustice. And that was all he had ever wanted. He continued serving for a few more years, respected by everyone around him. When he finally retired, his colleagues surprised him with a small ceremony. They presented him with a plaque, not for bravery in battle, but for courage in life. The words on it read, "For showing the world that true strength lies in calmness, honor, and truth." He smiled as he accepted it. He didn't say much, just a simple thank you. After the ceremony, as people gathered to take pictures, one of his friends asked, "Do you ever wish that night never happened?" The major looked thoughtful for a moment, then shook his head slowly. "No," he said softly. "It showed me who I am. It showed me who we can all be, even when the world isn't fair." He knew life wasn't perfect. There would always be people who judged before understanding, people who acted out of fear instead of respect. But he also knew there would always be those who stood for what's right. Even when it wasn't easy, that belief, that quiet, steady faith in humanity, was what carried him forward. Years later, When people spoke about him, they didn't just talk about the night he was stopped. They talked about how he handled it, how he turned a painful moment into a message of hope. His story became one that parents told their children, that teachers shared in classrooms, that officers mentioned in training sessions. It wasn't a story about anger or punishment. It was a story about patience, grace, and the strength of character. And that's how he wanted it to be remembered, because in the end, the world doesn't change through shouting or fighting. It changes through understanding. One calm voice, one honest action, one human story at a time. That night at the gas station could have broken him. Instead, it shaped him. And though the memory never fully faded, it no longer brought pain. It brought purpose. As he sat by his window years later, watching the sun rise over the quiet street, he smiled softly. He knew he had done his part, not just as a soldier, but as a man who believed in what was right. And that was enough. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about battles or victories. They're about the quiet strength it takes to stay kind in an unkind world. His story ended not with bitterness, but with peace, and the belief that truth, no matter how long it takes, will always find the light.